The red ships came from the darkness between stars, bringing death wherever they went. For 30 long years, the Kethmoran Syndicate had turned peaceful worlds into burning graveyards. Their warships were monsters of metal and fire, each one the size of a small city, covered in weapons that could crack planets in half. Commander Vraktal stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Bone Render, watching another world die below him. The planet had been beautiful once, with silver cities that sparkled in the sunlight and green forests that stretched to the horizon. Now those cities were nothing but glowing holes in the ground, and black smoke rose from what used to be homes, where families lived and children played. "Sir, the harvest is finished," said his tactical officer, a creature with too many eyes and sharp teeth. "We've taken 10,000 people as slaves. The mining machines got almost all the valuable metals from their cities." Vraktal made a clicking sound with his mouthparts, the way his species did when they were pleased. He looked at the numbers on his screen. 10,000 people who would spend the rest of their lives working in the Syndicate's mines and factories. Enough rare metals to build 3 more warships. "Good work," he growled, his voice like grinding stone. "Mark this world as stripped. We move to the next system tomorrow." Through the massive windows of his bridge, Vraktal could see his fleet spreading across space like a red plague. 12 dreadnoughts, each one carrying enough firepower to destroy a moon. Hundreds of smaller ships filled with soldiers and mining equipment. The largest raiding fleet the galaxy had ever seen. Every intelligent species in this part of space knew the sight of those crimson hulls with their skull markings. When people saw those ships coming, they didn't try to fight. They ran, they hid. They prayed to whatever gods they believed in, but it never helped. The Syndicate always caught them. Vraktal remembered the early days when his people first started raiding. Back then, some worlds tried to fight back. They had defense fleets and orbital weapons platforms. They thought they could protect themselves. But Kethmoran technology was advanced beyond anything else in the galaxy. Their plasma cannons could melt through any armor. Their void torpedoes could tear holes in space itself. One by one, every civilization that tried to resist had been crushed. Now, most worlds didn't even bother to call for help when the red ships appeared. They knew no one would come. The galactic government was weak and far away. The local defense forces were jokes. No single power in all of known space had the strength to challenge the Syndicate. "Set course for the Zerion system," Vraktal ordered. "I hear they have some interesting crystal formations there, and butterfly people always make good slaves." The Bone Render turned away from the dying world, leaving behind empty cities and burning forests. Behind it, the rest of the fleet followed like hungry wolves. They had no idea that deep in space something was watching them, something that had been tracking their movements for weeks, something from a world they had never heard of, carrying weapons they couldn't imagine. The Kethmoran Syndicate had ruled through fear for 3 decades, but their reign of terror was about to meet something they had never encountered before. Zerion 7 was the kind of world that made you believe in peace. For 800 years, the Veltari had called this place home, building their cities from living crystal that grew like trees toward the sky. When the twin suns set each evening, those crystal towers would catch the light and throw rainbows across the landscape that could be seen from orbit. The Veltari themselves were gentle creatures, no bigger than human children, with wings like stained glass that shimmered when they moved. They spent their days tending crystal gardens and mining the singing stones that powered their simple technology. Violence was so foreign to them that they didn't even have words for war in their language. On this particular evening, families gathered on the crystal platforms outside their homes, sharing the traditional sunset meal. Children played between the towers, their laughter mixing with the musical chimes their wings made when they flew. Elder Whisper of Wind sat with her great-grandchildren, telling them stories of the old days when their ancestors first discovered how to grow cities from crystal seeds. Then the stars began to disappear. At first, nobody noticed. The twin suns were setting, and the sky was already darkening. But slowly, one by one, the familiar constellations vanished as massive shapes blocked out the light. The Veltari looked up in confusion, their delicate antennae twitching as they tried to understand what they were seeing. The first plasma beam lit up the sky like green lightning. It struck the tallest spire in the capital city, and 8 centuries of careful crystal growth vanished in an instant. The tower didn't just break, it melted, sending rivers of glowing liquid cascading down into the streets below. Panic spread through the city, faster than the falling crystal. The Veltari had never experienced an attack before. They didn't know how to run, how to hide, how to fight. They just stood there watching their beautiful world burn around them. Elder Whisper of Wind felt her heart breaking as she watched more plasma beams carve through the city like knives through paper. The crystal gardens where she had played as a child exploded into clouds of glittering dust. The singing stones went silent forever. "The communication center," she whispered to her aide, a young Veltari named Flutter of Hope. "We must warn others." They flew as fast as their wings could carry them through streets filled with falling crystal and choking smoke. The communication building was one of the few structures still standing, though cracks ran through its walls like spiderwebs. Flutter of Hope worked frantically at the ancient controls, sending out the strongest distress signal their equipment could manage. "Elder, I don't think anyone will hear us. We're too far from the main trade routes." "Then we die knowing we tried," Whisper of Wind said softly. She looked out through the cracked walls at her burning world. "Send this message. The Veltari of Zerion 7 face their end with dignity. We forgive those who could not save us. Remember that we lived and we loved, and we sang to the crystal gardens." The message shot out into space just as another plasma beam struck the communication tower. The building collapsed around them in a shower of singing crystal fragments, but far beyond the edge of the system, something was listening. Something that had been tracking the red ships for weeks, waiting for the right moment to act. In the darkness between stars, a single ship received the Veltari's final message, and its human crew felt their anger burn hotter than any plasma weapon. The bridge of the Bone Render was usually filled with the confident chatter of a crew that had never known defeat. Today something felt different. Scanner Adept Thexmore, a thin creature with pale skin and too many fingers, hunched over his sensor display with growing confusion. "Commander Vrakital," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm picking up something strange. Single ship bearing 27 Mark 6, but sir, it's like nothing I've ever seen before." Vrakital stomped across the bridge, his heavy boots making the metal floor ring. He was a massive creature, even by Kethmoran standards, with red eyes that glowed like coals and scars covering his grey hide from decades of battle. When he looked at the scanner readings, those red eyes narrowed to slits. The ship on the screen didn't look like anything in their vast databases. Where Kethmoran vessels were brutal and angular, covered in spikes and weapon pods, this thing was smooth as glass. It was black. Not the painted black of stealth ships, but a deep darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. You had to look twice to even see it against the stars. "How big is it?" Vrakital demanded. "Hard to tell, sir. The readings keep shifting. Maybe half the size of our smallest cruiser, but..." Thexmore's fingers danced over his controls, trying to get a better scan. "Sir, the energy readings don't make sense. This thing is putting out more power than our dreadnoughts, but I can't figure out how." Vrakital studied the strange ship's movements. It wasn't running away like most vessels did when they encountered the Syndicate fleet. It wasn't trying to hide either. It just sat there in space watching them like a predator studying its prey. "Could be salvagers," suggested his weapons officer, a scarred veteran named Korthek. "You know how it is, Commander. After we hit a world, the scavengers show up to pick through the wreckage. Salvagers don't carry that kind of power signature," Vrakital growled. He had been raiding for 40 years, and his instincts had kept him alive through countless battles. Right now, those instincts were screaming at him that something was very wrong. The tactical computers were having problems too. Every time they tried to analyze the mystery ship, the data would flicker and change. It was like the vessel was somehow interfering with their sensors just by existing. "Sir, should I hail them?" asked the communications officer. "No." Vrakital's voice was sharp. "We don't talk to unknowns, we destroy them." But even as he said it, he felt something cold crawling up his spine. In 30 years of commanding the most feared fleet in the galaxy, he had never backed down from a fight. He had crushed entire battle groups without breaking a sweat. So why did this single silent ship make him feel like he was staring into the eyes of death itself? "Keep scanning," he ordered. "I want to know everything about that ship. What it's made of, where it came from, what weapons it's carrying. Everything." But deep in the darkness of space, the mystery vessel continued its patient watch. Its sensors, far more advanced than anything the Kethmorans possessed, were doing their own scanning. And the humans aboard were very carefully counting every gun, every shield generator, every weak point on the Syndicate fleet. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Captain Jinwoo had been in space for 6 months, but he still wasn't used to the silence. Back on Earth there was always noise, traffic, voices, the hum of machinery. Out here in the deep black, the only sounds were the quiet whispers of his ship's systems and the soft breathing of his crew. The UES Retribution was humanity's first real attempt at exploring beyond their solar system. She wasn't the biggest ship ever built, but she was the most advanced. Every system had been designed by the brightest minds on Earth, incorporating technology reverse-engineered from alien wreckage that had been found drifting in space over the years. Jin Woo stood at the center of the bridge, watching the main screen with growing horror. The images were coming from long-range sensors, but they were clear enough. A beautiful world with crystal cities was being torn apart by weapons that turned matter into energy. He could see the graceful spires melting like candles in a furnace. "Captain," called out Communications Officer Hei Young from her station. She was young, barely out of the academy, but her voice was steady, despite what they were all witnessing. "I'm picking up distress signals from the planet. Multiple sources. They're asking for help." Jinwoo closed his eyes for a moment. When Earth's leaders had given him command of the Retribution, their orders had been simple: explore, learn, and protect human interests. They hadn't said anything about getting involved in alien conflicts. They hadn't prepared him for watching an entire civilization die while he had the power to do something about it. "What's our tactical situation?" he asked his weapons officer, Lieutenant Minho. "So we're detecting 12 large vessels in the attacking fleet. Their technology appears to be plasma-based, probably more advanced than anything we've seen before. We're outnumbered 12-1. But we're not outgunned," Jinwoo said quietly. The Retribution carried weapons that no alien species had ever encountered, weapons based on principles that human scientists had discovered by studying the wreckage of a dozen different civilizations. The distress signals were getting weaker now. On the screen, Jinwoo could see that most of the crystal cities had been reduced to glowing craters. Somewhere down there, innocent people were dying while he stood here calculating odds and following orders. "Sir," Hei Young's voice was barely above a whisper. "The signals are fading. I think they're all going to die." Jinwoo thought about his daughter back on Earth. She was only 8 years old, with bright eyes and a laugh that could light up a room. What would she think of her father if she knew he had stood by and watched while children just like her were murdered? "Captain?" His first officer, Commander So Young, was looking at him with understanding in her eyes. She had children too. Jinwoo made his decision. Earth's leaders had sent him out here to represent humanity among the stars. Well, this was what humanity stood for: protecting the innocent, standing up to bullies, doing what was right even when it was dangerous. "All hands to battle stations," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ship. "Charge all weapons systems. Bring us around to attack Vector 77 Alpha. We're going in." The bridge erupted into controlled activity as his crew prepared for humanity's first real battle among the stars. None of them had ever faced odds like this before, but they were human, and humans had never backed down from a fight when innocent lives were at stake. The red ships had no idea what was coming for them. The message cut through space like a knife through silk, transmitted on frequencies that the Kethmoran Syndicate had claimed as their own for decades. Every ship in their fleet received it at the same time, clear as a bell, despite the interference from their plasma weapons. "Kethmoran vessels, this is Captain Jin Woo of the United Earth. Ship Retribution. Cease your attack immediately and withdraw from this system." The voice was calm, almost conversational, like someone asking a neighbor to turn down their music. There was no fear in it, no desperation, just a simple statement delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. On the bridge of the Bone Render, the silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then Commander Vractil's laughter exploded across the command deck like thunder. It was a sound that had terrified captured prisoners for 30 years, a deep rumbling that seemed to shake the very air. "Did you hear that?" he roared to his crew, wiping tears from his red eyes. "Did you all hear what this fool just said?" His laughter started up again, even louder this time. "Another species sends a single ship to threaten us. One ship." The bridge crew joined in with nervous chuckles. They had heard stories like this before, though not many. Occasionally, some brave or foolish captain would try to interfere with a syndicate raid. It never ended well for them. "Sir," said Weapons Officer Korthek, "should we respond?" "Oh, yes." Vractal's eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "Give them our standard greeting. I want this Earth species to understand what happens when you challenge the syndicate." The Bone Render's massive guns began to turn, their targeting systems locking, onto the small dark ship that had dared to issue demands. These were weapons that could crack moons, powered by the collected energy of a dozen conquered worlds. Around the flagship, 7 other dreadnoughts followed suit, their gun batteries swiveling like the eyes of hunting predators. "Unknown vessel." Korthek transmitted back, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have 10 seconds to flee before we demonstrate why the galaxy fears us. This is your only warning." In the depths of space, the human ship didn't move. It didn't turn to run. Didn't try to hide behind asteroids or space debris. It just sat there, as if it were considering the threat. Then Jinwu's voice came again, and this time there was something different about it. The calm was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that made even veteran raiders pause in their preparations. "Last warning," the human captain said, and his words seemed to carry the weight of worlds. "Stand down or be destroyed." Vractal stopped laughing. In 40 years of raiding, commanding fleets, and conquering systems, no one had ever spoken to him like that. Not with that absolute certainty, that complete lack of fear. It was the voice of someone who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. "Sir?" Korthek's finger hovered over the firing control. "Orders?" For a moment, just a moment, Vractal hesitated. Something deep in his warrior's instincts was screaming at him to be careful, to think this through. But pride and decades of easy victories overruled caution. "Fire," he snarled. "Turn that arrogant little ship into cosmic dust. Show them what happens when insects try to challenge gods." 8 dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously, their combined firepower enough to vaporize a small moon. The space around the human vessel erupted in brilliant light, as enough energy to power a civilization for a year converged on a single point. But in the depths of that firestorm, something impossible happened. The human ship was still there. The explosion lit up half the solar system. 8 dreadnoughts firing at once created a ball of energy so bright it could be seen from neighboring star systems. Plasma bolts the size of city blocks converged on the tiny human ship, each one carrying enough power to melt a mountain. Void torpedoes that could tear holes in space itself streaked toward their target like hungry predators. For a moment, the retribution disappeared completely inside a miniature sun of destructive energy. The Kethmoran crews cheered, certain that nothing could survive such overwhelming firepower. They had used the same tactic to destroy entire battle fleets. Then the light faded, and their cheers died in their throats. The human ship was still there. "Impossible," Vractal whispered, his red eyes wide with disbelief. He had seen that same attack reduce entire space stations to glowing gas. Nothing could survive it. Nothing. But the retribution wasn't just surviving, it was completely undamaged. Around the sleek black hull, the air itself seemed to shimmer and bend like looking at something through water. The plasma bolts and torpedoes hadn't been stopped by armor or shields. They had been twisted away by something that played with the laws of physics, like a child with toys. "Sir," Scanner Adept Thexmore's voice was high with panic. "They're defensive. Systems are unlike anything in our databases. It's like they're bending space around their ship." Captain Jinwu's voice cut through their confusion, calm as ever. "Your turn is over. Now it's ours." The human warship began to move, and Vractal felt his blood turn to ice. He had seen thousands of ships in combat, but nothing moved like this. The retribution flowed through space like liquid mercury, its hull rippling and changing. As he watched, what had looked like solid metal was actually something alive, something that could reshape itself in real time. "Weapons firing," shouted Korthek. But where were the weapons? The human ship's hull was completely smooth, with no visible gun ports or missile tubes. Then, as Vractal watched in growing horror, the hull began to open like a flower. Weapons emerged from what had seemed like empty space, long rails that hummed with electromagnetic energy, beam arrays that glowed with contained starfire, and stranger things that his eyes couldn't quite process. The first railgun fired, and Vractal learned what human ingenuity could do when pushed to its limits. Instead of a single projectile, a stream of metal flew toward the dread harvester at a significant fraction of light speed. Each piece was no bigger than a grain of sand, but moving so fast that when they hit the dreadnought's armor, they went through it like it wasn't there. The dread harvester, pride of the Syndicate's fleet, developed 1,000 tiny holes that glowed white-hot. Secondary explosions began to ripple through its hull as the superheated metal found ammunition stores and fuel tanks. Evasive maneuvers, Vractal roared, but it was too late. The human beam weapons fired next, and these were even stranger. The energy beams didn't just hit their targets, they seemed to learn from each impact. The first beam that struck the skull render was absorbed by its shields. The second beam was slightly different and got through. The third beam cut through the ship's armor like it was made of paper. Within minutes, Vractal was watching his entire fleet, ships that had terrorized the galaxy for decades, being systematically dismantled by a single human vessel. And the worst part was the cold efficiency of it all. There was no anger, no revenge, just the methodical destruction of a threat by beings who had clearly evolved beyond such crude emotions. For the first time in 40 years, Commander Vractal knew what it felt like to be prey. The Dread Harvest had been Vractal's pride for 15 years. It was a kilometer-long monster of metal and fury, armed with enough firepower to level continents. He had watched it reduce entire enemy fleets to scrap metal without taking a single hit in return. Now he watched it die. The human ship's weapons had been testing the dreadnought's defenses for barely 30 seconds, each shot slightly different. From the last, the first few beams had been absorbed by the Dread Harvest's shields, just as they were designed to do. But the humans weren't using normal weapons. Their guns were learning. The seventh beam found exactly the right frequency to make the shields collapse like a house of cards. The eighth beam punched through the hull and found the main reactor. The explosion that followed lit up space like a second sun, and when the light faded, there was nothing left but glowing debris. "No," Vractal whispered, his massive hands gripping the command rail so hard that the metal began to bend. "This isn't possible." But it was happening right before his eyes. The Skullbreaker, commanded by his old friend Torek, was trying to flee when something small and fast shot out from the human ship. At first, Vractal thought it was a missile. Then he realized it was a boarding pod. The pod hit the Skullbreaker's hull and simply melted through it, like acid eating through paper. Through his view screen, Vractal could see armored figures pouring out of the hole, human soldiers in powered suits that made them look like metal giants. "Sir," came the panicked voice of his communications officer, "Captain Torek is requesting immediate assistance. He says the humans are cutting through his ship like it's made of soft clay." On the tactical display, Vractal watched red dots representing his ships wink out one by one. The Bloodfang tried to run and was crippled by a weapon that somehow wrapped around its engines and crushed them. The Terror of Worlds attempted to ram the human ship and simply bounced off their shields like a toy. Tactical officer. Hyojin's voice drifted across space from the human ship, calm and professional. "Enemy dreadnought Skullbreaker disabled. Boarding pods deployed. Marine teams Alpha and Beta report minimal resistance. Vractal's elite warriors, the most feared soldiers in the galaxy, were being described as minimal resistance by these humans. Each of his ships carried thousands of troops armed with plasma rifles and void grenades. They had conquered entire star systems. Through his viewports, he could see the boarding action taking place on the Skullbreaker. The human Marines moved through the corridors of the dreadnought like they owned the place, their powered armor shrugging off weapons fire that should have melted them. They fought with a precision that was almost mechanical, never wasting a shot, never taking an unnecessary risk. But it wasn't just their equipment that was superior. Vractal had been in enough battles to recognize tactical genius when he saw it. These humans fought like they had studied every weakness in Kethmoran ship design, like they had trained for this exact scenario for years. "How?" he demanded of his tactical officer. "How do they know our ships so well?" Thexmore's voice was shaking as he replied, "Sir, I think they've been watching us, learning from us. Every ship we've destroyed, every battle we've fought, they've been taking notes." The realization hit Vractal like a physical blow. For weeks, maybe months, this human ship had been following his fleet through space, studying their tactics, analyzing their weaknesses. While he had been focused on easy targets and helpless worlds, real predators had been hunting him. "Orders." "Sir?" asked Korthek, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Vractal looked at his tactical display. Of 12 dreadnoughts, only 4 were still operational. The rest were either destroyed or disabled, their crews either dead or captured by human marines who fought like demons from some nightmare realm. For the first time in 40 years of commanding the most feared fleet in the galaxy, Vractal spoke. Words he had never thought he would say: "All ships retreat." "Retreat! All ships retreat!" The words tore from Vractal's throat like broken glass. In 40 years of commanding the most feared fleet in the galaxy, he had never spoken those words, never even thought them. The Kethmoran Syndicate didn't retreat. They conquered. They destroyed. They took what they wanted and left nothing but ash behind. But now, as he stared at his tactical display, reality crashed down on him like a collapsing building. Of his 12 mighty dreadnoughts, only 4 were still capable of moving under their own power. The Bone Render shuddered around him, her hull cracked and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen wounds. Emergency lights flickered as damaged systems struggled to keep the ship alive. "Sir, the Death's Edge is losing power to her engines," reported his communications officer, his voice barely steady. "Captain Vexmore is requesting assistance." "Leave them," Vractal snarled, hating himself for the words. "Anyone who can't keep up gets left behind." It went against everything the Syndicate stood for. They were supposed to be brothers in blood, united in their conquest of the weak. But the human ship was still out there, still hunting them, and Vractal's only thought now was survival. The 4 surviving dreadnoughts limped through space like wounded animals, their proud crimson hulls blackened and torn. Behind them, the wreckage of their sister ships drifted in slowly expanding clouds of debris. Hundreds of thousands of Kethmoran warriors, the elite of their species, were either dead or captured. "Hyperspace threshold in 30 seconds, called out the navigation officer. Vractal allowed himself a moment of hope. Once they jumped to hyperspace, they would be safe. The human ship, no matter how advanced, couldn't follow them across the galaxy. They could regroup, rebuild, plan their revenge. Then Jinwoo's voice cut through space one more time, calm and measured as always. "This is Captain Jinwoo of the UES Retribution to all listening stations across the galaxy. I am transmitting complete battle recordings of our engagement with the Kethmoran Syndicate fleet at Zarian 7. Let it be known that the age of their terror is over." Vractal's blood turned to ice. Every major civilization in the galaxy monitored long-range communications. Trade stations, military outposts, diplomatic missions, they would all receive this transmission. Within hours, every sentient being in known space would see the mighty Syndicate running like scared children from a single human ship. "Sir, we're getting responses," his communications officer said, his voice full of dread. "Dozens of them. The Altarian Trade Federation is broadcasting it on all commercial frequencies. The Zephyrian Council is already analyzing our tactical weaknesses. The Galactic News Network is calling it the miracle of Zarion 7. The recordings were spreading faster than wildfire. On 1,000 worlds, beings who had lived in fear of the red ships were watching their tormentors being systematically destroyed by strange warriors from a world called Earth. Children who had hidden when they heard the Syndicate's name were learning that monsters could be defeated. "Jump to hyperspace!" Vractal roared. "Now!" The 4 surviving ships disappeared into the swirling vortex of folded space, leaving behind the wreckage of their fleet and their reputation. But the damage was already done. The recordings were out there, spreading across the galaxy like a virus carrying a simple message. The Kethmoran Syndicate could be beaten. On distant worlds, slaves in syndicate mines looked up at the stars with hope for the first time in years. Colonial governments that had paid tribute to avoid destruction began to wonder if they still needed to. Pirates and raiders who had operated under syndicate protection started looking over their shoulders. The galaxy was changing. For 30 years, the red ships had been the ultimate predators, unstoppable and merciless. Now, everyone knew the truth. There were bigger predators out there. Hunters who came from a small blue world on the edge of known space, and they didn't like bullies. As the Retribution began to patrol the wreckage field, searching for survivors to rescue, Captain Jinwoo opened a channel to the dying world below. Zerion 7, this is the UES Retribution. Medical and rescue teams are standing by. The threat has been neutralized. The age of human guardianship had begun. The message traveled faster than light itself, racing through the galaxy's communication networks like wildfire. Within 6 hours of the battle at Zerion 7, beings on 1,000 different worlds were watching the impossible unfold on their screens. They saw the mighty Kethmoran fleet, terror of the galaxy for 30 years, being systematically destroyed by a single ship from a world none of them had ever heard of. They watched plasma cannons that could crack moons bounce harmlessly off strange shields that bent space itself. They witnessed boarding pods melting through armor like it was made of ice, and human warriors fighting with a precision that seemed almost supernatural, but most importantly, they saw the red ships running away. Elder Whisper of Wind was among the first to send a message. She had survived the attack on Zerion 7, pulled from the wreckage of the communication tower by human rescue teams. Her wings were singed and her voice was weak, but her words carried across space with the weight of truth. People of Earth, we owe you a debt that spans generations. You came to our aid when no one else would. You fought for us when we could not fight for ourselves. The Veltari will never forget this kindness. Her message was just the beginning. Within hours, Earth's communication networks were flooded with transmissions from across the galaxy. The Altarian Trade Federation, which had paid tribute to the Syndicate for decades, offered exclusive trade agreements. The Zephyrian Council, whose worlds had been raided countless times, requested formal military alliance. Small colonies on the outer rim sent simple messages of gratitude. Mining stations that had lived in constant fear expressed their relief. Even the proud Centaurian Empire, which had never acknowledged the existence of humans before, sent a diplomatic note expressing their interest in opening communications with this new galactic power. Captain Jinwoo sat in his quarters aboard the Retribution, scrolling through message after message. His communications officer, Hei Young, had given up trying to categorize them all. They were coming in too fast from too many different sources. "Sir," Commander So Young knocked on his door, "we're receiving priority transmissions from Earth Command. They want to know what our next move should be." Jinwoo looked out through his viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, the surviving Kethmoran ships were limping back to their home bases, carrying news of their defeat. Other raiders and pirates were probably already making plans to fill the power vacuum. The galaxy was about to become a very dangerous place. "Tell Earth Command that we're continuing our patrol," he said finally. "There are more systems out there that need protection. Sir, we're just one ship. We can't patrol the entire galaxy." Jinwoo smiled. "We don't have to patrol the entire galaxy. We just have to make sure everyone knows we're out here. That when innocent people call for help, humans will answer." 3 days later, the Retribution received a distress call from the Kepler Mining Collective. Pirates were attacking their asteroid facilities, and the local defense force was overwhelmed. When Jinwoo arrived in the system, he found the raiders already fleeing. Word had spread. There was a human ship in the area, and it didn't tolerate attacks on civilians. The rescue ships that followed the Retribution to Zerion 7 found something remarkable. The Veltari had already begun rebuilding their crystal cities, but this time they were different. Mixed in with the traditional crystal formations were new structures made from materials the humans had provided. Technologies that would help them defend themselves if the raiders ever returned. Similar stories began spreading across the galaxy. Humans didn't just fight the bullies, they helped their victims become stronger. They shared their knowledge, their technology, their medical supplies. They asked for nothing in return except the promise that those they helped would extend the same kindness to others. As the Retribution slipped into hyperspace, bound for another system where civilians needed protection, the galaxy held its breath. For the first time in living memory, the strong were protecting the weak instead of preying on them. Humanity had announced itself to the stars not as conquerors, but as guardians. The universe would never be the same.